Well, it's a little after 11, and I do want us to get started. I'm seeing people still rolling in, which is exciting. But yeah, I just want to say I'm excited everybody's here. There's just so much going on within design thinking here at Spectrum over the past year, and um, just getting a chance to talk a little bit more about that and share some of that is just, yeah, something that I'm looking forward to doing. So I'm going to try doing things a little bit differently. So if you notice, I'm actually not using PowerPoint. I'm actually using Miro. And so Miro is kind of a great tool that I've used, to be honest, probably 7 hours a day, just to be able to start interacting and thinking through things. And so we'll see how this works from a presentation standpoint. But first off, I just want to introduce myself. Again, my name is Aaron Schaap. I've actually been here for about a year now, a little over a year here at Spectrum. And some of my background has actually been more in the entrepreneurial space. Oh, it looks like some of you guys have your mics on, so that might help just to kind of mute you guys. And then later we can kind of open that up. But again, a lot of my background is been around the entrepreneurial space. And so I kind of joke that Spectrum Health has been my first corporate job, because for the past kind of 20 years, I've been actually launching and running a lot of my own companies. And one of those companies was around a company called Elevator Up. It helped create, helping other companies create better products, services, and overall experiences. And so we ran a design and innovation firm that really spent a lot of time helping companies that were small companies looking to go into large markets, or large companies looking to act like startups. I ran that for 15 years, and in this past, well, I guess now, April of 2019, we actually were successfully acquired. And so I was able to exit out of that and start exploring some new things. But one of the things that we were also doing in an Elevator Up, my company, was as we helped other people, we also kind of got that itch ourselves. And so if you're in like the Grand Rapids area, you might have heard of a place called The Factory. And The Factory is a co-working space. I joke that it's kind of like Cheers, but for work, right? Where it's a place where you can come and kind of get to know people and interact with people at a time when we actually were all getting together. We had roughly 1,000 people a month kind of flowing through our space through different activities and events. And that just kind of really allowed us to kind of explore how people work and how people work in collaboration. And that continued to grow into how people then learn. And so really we kind of say we were designing serendipity. And then later we started creating almost like a subscription to curiosity. And we created a kind of a state recognized program around kind of teaching people a lot of these principles. So now I'm here at Spectrum after exiting out of those companies and just kind of exploring how do we start to share some of these same principles and some of these same techniques inside of Spectrum. And so I'm in the ATO, which is the Agile Transformation Office, as an enterprise design and agility lead, really exploring like how do we introduce more agility and customer centricity into our everyday work. And a large part of that really has been a focus on our users, and doing that is we've been using design thinking. Now, to kind of get started, I don't get a chance to kind of probably see you guys all in a big room. And so I kind of had to make some assumptions of who's here and what everybody's understanding is. And so I'm kind of breaking everybody up into these like 3 groups. The first group is, I'm assuming that you're really beginning, you're just starting your journey in design thinking. Maybe this is your first interaction with it. And if asked, you'd say, well, what is design thinking? You'd say, well, it's just using a lot of sticky notes. And maybe using Miro means I'm a design thinker. And whereas that might be casually true, there's a lot more that I'm excited to share with you around design thinking besides just the sticky notes. Now, there's another group of you guys that are probably starting to use empathy maps and customer journey maps, and you're finding a way to start using this within your work. And so you're literally looking at, well, how do I continue to make myself a little bit better and learn more about these techniques besides just some of those basic elements? And then some of you are probably going to slightly critique me throughout this whole presentation because you could do a better job than me. And those are people who are, professional coaches and facilitators and has run a bunch of these workshops. And so I appreciate that we've got a lot of different types of people on the call here. And what I really wanted to do is, I think that by having so many different types of people, that's both great, but also sometimes confusing because design thinking can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people or be expressed in a lot of different ways. And so what I wanted to do is just kind of help center us just from the start of what is design thinking. And so just really simply, design thinking is a problem-solving framework and kind of a bit of an ideology for coming up with creative solutions. Now, we have a lot of frameworks that are out there for getting things done, but the unique thing about design thinking is how it really completely centers us on humans and human outcomes, right? And so moving things from business goals and business needs into human goals, into human needs. And so often we find ourselves jumping right into hard problems and trying to solve them for kind of businesses while never really fully understanding what exactly we're building or who we're building it for and what problem we're actually trying to solve. And so design thinking does a great job of giving us that framework to see problems and solutions from a new point of view. Again, helping us kind of not just look at the business goals and the business needs, but translating those into the human goals and the human needs that we have. Now, the question I often get is like, well, why now, right? And to be honest, we just have a lot going on. There's a lot of things that don't seem to be slowing down. And on top of that, if you ask anybody, the healthcare experience overall is just generally pretty complex. It's overwhelming. It's tough to navigate. And consumers are really wanting to engage with healthcare like they would with something like Starbucks or even Amazon. And so on top of that, those pressures are coming to us as teams to continue to grow and solve those problems. And our teams are being pushed to be more collaborative, be more diverse, and to solve these problems while somehow trying to keep a sense of belonging and purpose into what we're doing. And to that effect, I think design thinking helps us in a few ways that I wanted to kind of highlight. One of those ways, again, is it just helps us focus on real people and real problems. So whether you're responsible for re-envisioning kind of like a whole customer experience for our whole healthcare system, or you're just trying to plan your next product release, design thinking keeps us focused on what really matters to the users most, and then your teams and how your teams can actually move those ideas to outcomes. And then, of course, once we release these things, right, we can then go back and observe people using what we've created and even bring them along with us to make those things better. The next area that I found design thinking has really been helping us here at Spectrum is it builds stronger teams. Now, along with helping us focus on our users, it also helps us strengthen their teams by creating common language and artifacts and just building a culture of trust around that. And inside of that shared vocabulary, that happens by involving all team members at the beginning and seeing things all along the way and reflecting together and making together and bringing things that we can test and interact with real people. Now, the artifacts by themselves inside of design thinking are really foundational pieces that kind of help design thinking or to help kind of encourage teams to really show and not to tell. And so it gets us into more of like talking about things all the time and start to show those things. And through that process, we start to establish things like you would say empathy maps or journey maps or wireframes and prioritization metrics that many of these activities are all done as teams. And most of these are pretty visual and often story driven. And that kind of drives us then into that, then because we're doing those things creates a culture of trust, which happens when we're working shoulder to shoulder and relying on people to get things done. And it allows us to talk honestly with one another while continuing to learn along the way. Now, the last thing that I think people often look at as design thinking is they say, great, design thinking is great, but we're just thinking I want to do some stuff. And when you really start to understand and to apply design thinking, it's not just about thinking and understanding the problems. That's the first part of it. The next stage is we need to start to do stuff. And so it encourages you to make in order to learn and exploring multiple avenues for the same problem. Using activities like a storyboarding or future state scenarios, or even starting to come up with like physical and digital prototypes are just a few ways that we found that we can create ways of learning doing. Tim Brown of IDEO kind of talks about this. He says the faster we make our ideas tangible, the sooner we're able to evaluate them, refine them, and zero in on our best solutions. Now, this has all been around for a little while. It's like this isn't something that kind of just popped up. So I wanted to just take a minute to reflect a little bit about kind of where design thinking came from. And a lot of that has started out in the early 60s. We owe a lot of credit to William, this guy here, as an inventor of a lot of the creative problem-solving techniques that we have today. And he's one of the first publishers of a lot of those methods. And he was known for really kind of joining together different and kind of apparently like irrelevant elements. So like, for example, here, he's pictured holding a bunch of leaves in a vase that really inspired the creation of Pringles. And I think that's kind of a really creative and obviously inspiring way where you can start to look at kind of things that work in one area could also kind of help solve the problems in the area that you may be focusing on. Plus, like, who doesn't love some Pringles? As we move kind of from the 60s, that moves us into the 70s where Horst Rittel starts to be really inspired by a lot of the work and kind of begins to realize that design thinking is especially useful when addressing these problems, which are what he calls like wicked problems, things like social and large cultural problems of the time, and begins to use these techniques to take those larger issues and say, we can actually start to approach these really ambiguous and large problems and break them down into smaller, more understandable ways. That then moves us into the 80s, in which Donald, an MIT social scientist and consultant, begins exploring how professionals really go about problem solving. And he starts to find that like it's less of a formula of learning learning a bunch of formulas out of graduate school and more on the capabilities of professionals to continuously think about what they're doing while they're doing it. So he starts to coin the phrase learning by doing, which again, you probably heard me talk a little bit about, where we're not just doing design thinking, but we're also doing design doing. Now, at this point, we now get into the 90s. And to the 90s, besides it being a great decade, it's also one of those things where IDEO starts to really get a lot of attention. And the reason for that is because they've taken a lot of those methods that we've just kind of talked about before. And what they do is they start to package those things up and start to showcase that process and starts to create a lot of amazing new products and services, but also starts to get the business community really excited. Now, from a lot of that excitement, Stanford starts to jump in on that, also partners with IDEO and starts to create what's called the D School. And the D School is Stanford's process of teaching innovation and teaching creativity in a pretty formalized way. And what's interesting is they actually start to do that in the business school and start to teaching people how to kind of do this in a repeatable way and kind of taking it out of this kind of eureka moment. From the 20s, right, or not the 20s, the 2000s, that kind of brings us into 2010, where kind of beginning her career as a strategist within Boston Consulting Group, or BCG, which we actually use here at Spectrum today. Janine realizes pretty quickly that these techniques that people are starting to use to solve some of these really hard problems, or problems that people are using to be creative on products and services, they really start to be things that the C-suite can start to use. And she begins to use those to help executives create strategy and manage a lot of that change. Article within Harvard Business Review really kind of highlights a lot of that. And that creates a lot of interest within the C-suite around using design thinking to solve some of these really large problems or wicked problems, like I heard earlier from Horst Rittel. Now, as we move from 2010, that kind of moves us into today, which is just overall healthcare. And there's a lot of change obviously happening within healthcare. And there's a lot of claims in which design thinking start to come at the healthcare system and start to say, we can help solve this. And interesting enough, the CDC actually starts to address that and starts to look at those claims and begins doing some studies around how does actually design thinking work within healthcare. And I really I'm actually going to read kind of what I wrote down here. because the CDC then goes on to start to make a couple of statements saying applying design thinking to healthcare enhances innovation, efficiency, and effectiveness by increasing the focus on patients and provider needs. Healthcare systems require continuous innovation to meet the needs of patients and providers. However, these stakeholders are not always considered when new interventions or system processes are designed, which results in products that remain unused because they do not account for human context, need, or fallibility. Design thinking offers a way to close the gap by helping investigators incorporate user needs and feedback throughout the development process. And I thought that was an amazing kind of like statement that they started pushing that out. If you just Google CDC design thinking, you'll start to see some of their larger kind of reports and analysis around that of just how design thinking can start to really help us kind of tackle some of these really large complex problems. So inside of that, there's a lot that's kind of been going on, but the question is, well, then how do we do that here? And for the past year, a lot of there's been kind of an ad hoc cross-departmental team that's really been collaborating around many of these principles. We've had a chance to partner with other healthcare systems to see how they do design thinking. We've been able to partner and start to collaborate with different Fortune 50 companies and 500 companies to narrow in on just what are some common approaches, because design thinking, if you Google it, there's a lot of ways to be able to do that, but there is some pretty common patterns and pretty common standards, and we wanted to make sure that those kind of started to work inside of Spectrum Health. And so that all of that kind of came into starting to establish some of these basic principles, which I'll kind of walk through. One of those is, what are our principles and how do we approach these problems? The next one is the loop, which really kind of guides us into how we do this work in a continuous way, and then the keys that kind of hold us all together. Now, to jump into that a little bit, I want to talk about just the principles. Now, the principles is one of the ways to think about a principles is how do we know if we're doing design thinking or not doing design thinking? And the easiest way is to say, well, is it human focused? Are we really focusing on human outcomes? You can do a stakeholder map and you can do brainstorming sessions, but unless you're focused on humans and the human needs, then you're not doing design thinking. It might still be a valuable exercise, but we want to understand what's allowing us to do design thinking and not doing it. And then, of course, restless reinvention helps us kind of understand this, how to continue to reimagine our work, and then working with diverse, empowered teams. So moving into that a little bit, again, human outcomes is really the core of design thinking. That kind of takes it from every other problem-solving framework, and it just has a unique focus on focusing on those human outcomes. And we really kind of need to kind of change this. Success isn't really measured by like the features that we ship. It's really measured by how we fulfill our users' needs. And most importantly, we need to like earn that trust and respect and repeat of our business of these people that we serve when we put them first. And so here is a great example of where, just getting a chance to connect people who weren't able to come into the hospital, those are human connections, and those are actually why we're here and what we're trying to do. Now, there's a lot of features, a lot of functions that it takes to be able to get there, but it is important for us to kind of keep that human focus. Restless reinvention just really helps us focus on it's a little bit better every day, right? And so an example here, you can see Spectrum Health was kind of starting to imagine, like, well, what would kind of this new process look like when people start to do, a COVID vaccines, or even just getting tested, and how do we even redesign a parking lot, and where would we put signs? And of course, there's ways you can begin to prototype that at a very basic level just by putting something out there and starting to move that around and getting some feedback from people. And then in diverse teams, design thinking is really done poorly when it's
Christ.
Oh, that's awesome. So hopefully that was a matter of like a eureka moment kind of for us. But oh, we got somebody. Did you have a question? I think there was just some side stuff. But I think that kind of emphasizes my point, right? Diverse teams, we've got all kinds of people with all kinds of things going on, but design thinking is done when we done best when we all do that together. Now, the loop is, I think, what kind of helps us really kind of know how to continue to kind of move forward in design thinking. And if you look at design thinking as a little bit more of like this feeling, like, do you feel like we need to be observing right now as a team? Do we feel like we need to be reflecting as a group and understanding what we know today and kind of what we already kind of feel like we have at our fingertips, or we feel like we need to make something? And what's great about the loop is that we can kind of jump in at any spot. But it encourages us to go out and just go observe people, talk to people, interact with people, and then reflect on the things that we've learned, reflect as a team, create plans, and then go make things. So if you don't really know where kind of to start, these are some basic questions that can kind of help us think through how do we get out of the office and how do we kind of immerse ourselves in the real world in order to kind of get to know our users, uncover those needs, understand the context, listens for feedbacks. And so what we're trying to do in this step of observing is we're trying to understand who are our users. And if you think about the projects that you're on, one of the best ways to kind of screw up a whole project or a whole meeting is to ask, okay, who are our users? And what problem are we solving? That's sometimes just an easiest way to derail something, but those are important questions to have. And just understanding who they are, what their needs are, and even just understanding what else is already out there. Those are things that we can quickly go out and understand. Then as we move into the reflect area, reflecting is often where who are we as a team and what are our capabilities? Who are our stakeholders? How do we understand kind of what we can do today? But also, as we've been doing a lot of these observations, how do we actually go from, as we do these observations, oops, thing moved there. How do we go from observing those things to then starting to reflect on the things that we've observed and putting together plans and moving forward? And then making really focuses on how do we kind of make things possible, creating stories around that, future states, brainstorming. This is often where you see a lot of like the sticky notes kind of happening. And then how do we deliver that and continue to deliver that? And so again, the loop really helps us kind of focus on this, again, loop where you can jump in at any point, right? You might be making things right now, but once you've made things, take a minute to take a step back and reflect as a team on the things that you've learned, and then go observe people using those things. And once you've observed people using those things, then how do we come back and continue to then reflect on the things that we've observed and then start making things a little bit better every day? Now with that kind of goes into then our keys. And our keys are, we wouldn't really need the keys if we were just kind of a small teams working on some problems. But the challenge is that we have a lot of really complex problems calling for really complex teams. And so what the keys do for us is it really helps us kind of keep things organized and kind of helps design thinking kind of not fall apart at scale. And so we talk about kind of the hills and playbacks and sponsored users. An example of some of those would be the hills. Now the hills tell us where to go, but not how to get there. It kind of empowers teams to explore kind of breakthrough ideas without losing sight of the goal. And so to write a hill, these are often things that we start with the users that you want to serve. Next, we specifically outline how we want to enable them to achieve those things. And then we want to kind of emphasize the differentiators that will make those solutions worth their while. And we refer to those often as the elements of the who, what, and the wow. Now, a hill can be something that can be done at a really large scale or something that is maybe just for your next sprint. So it could be something really large where we start to see something from kind of JFK where he talks about, I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth. Now, if you start to break that sentence down in kind of the who, what, and wow, like you don't always have to have them in a row, but we understand he's talking about a person. We need a real person to be on the moon. And then the what is, well, you got to get them to land there and return them back. And ideally, we want to do it before the end of this decade, which of course was a big deal kind of at that time. Now, one of the best, I think, hills that I've seen is within Gecko, they talk about 15 minutes could save you 15% or more on your insurance. Now, at first blush, that just sounds like a kind of a good little slogan or a gimmick, but if you really start to break that down, you talk about the who, what is like that's you as a person, but the what is within 15 minutes. And that's not something to take lightly, right? To do something within 15 minutes, that starts requiring us as teams to start creating teams of teams and breaking things down. The ability for me to go to the website and the website has to load really quickly. And beyond just having it load really quickly, I got to be able to then fill out the form pretty quickly, and that form needs to be able to start to process things and do things. And as far as the wow, not only do you need to know where I'm at and how much I'm paying, but you have to do 15% better than what I have right here. And that takes a lot of people and a lot of teams to be able to pull that together. Now, one of those inside of Spectrum Health that I thought was really interesting was a stroke patient receives TPA within 45 minutes of coming through the hospital door. Now, that was an amazing hill that really kind of set a bunch of teams into action, starting to wrestle with how do we accomplish this? Because we know every 15 minutes is a deal breaker, and you can't just have them when they first come in the door, kind of give them this. You have to actually do a lot of diagnosis. You have to kind of go through a lot of processes, and there's lots of different teams. And so teams of teams started to tackle this problem, but they all kind of knew what hill they were climbing and what they were trying to focus on. And where the hill idea comes from is, and as General Patterson is kind of talks about, never tell people how to do things, tell them what to accomplish, and they will surprise you with their ingenuity. And that's why hills are so important for us. It allows us to create these statements that can help center us on user outcomes. And then it allows us to get out of the way and empower teams to actually accomplish some great things. Now, playbacks are really helpful because they align us across time. And what playbacks do is they bring stakeholders into the loop in a safe place to tell stories and exchange feedback. And it often helps reveal misalignment or measurements around progress and kind of getting the big picture, because we don't all have the time to go into all of these different sessions. But what we can do is we can kind of share along the way. And a little bit of a anatomy of that, right? You got almost like this large P and small p kind of version of that, where you can do a playback very casually. Like if somebody were to come into the meeting a little bit late, I might say, hey, Chris, could you do a quick little playback on what's actually been happening so far? And we can just kind of rewind and briefly share where we're at and how we got there. And that just might be like a quick little playback. We might also have a really large playback, which is milestone based or a larger presentation. And we want to be able to share those things along the way. And that's where we invite a lot of the stakeholders in. We want to share those stories. Ideally, we want those to be human stories. And then we're listening for feedback and misalignment. And those are important for us. We don't want to just share kind of the sunny day scenario. We want to share where we're at today. And so we can actually get feedback about what's actually happening on our work. And so we can kind of quickly pivot or preserve what we're doing. And the last key item that kind of helps design thinking turn into enterprise design thinking is focusing on sponsored users. And sponsored users are real world users that help us regularly contribute their domain knowledge and their expertise to us. And I've had a chance to kind of work with some people inside of Spectrum and actually pull in real people who've committed to working on our project. And it's just been really helpful that as we are including those real users along the way, it's been really insightful to start to see what was starting to work or where we needed to start to make some changes. And we had some really good learnings well before we even got to something that was going to be released. Now, there are a couple of things to kind of consider around setting up users, because there's users all around us. And if you think about your projects, you can go out and start to interact with those people and pull them in a lot of different ways, but you do want to consider a few things. One is, are they representative of your target user group? So a good sponsored user really reflects the actual users that you intend to serve, not stakeholders. Stakeholders are really good, but those are partners on your initiative. You're really trying to focus on the end users that are going to be impacted by the work that you do. The next one is, are they personally invested in the outcome? A good sponsored user really cares just as much as you do about the outcomes. And so if they're not aligned and it isn't something they're interested in, it might not be a good sponsored user for you. And then the last one might be, are they available to contribute? A good sponsored user is open and willing to share their expertise and experience with your team all along the way, which is a bit of a commitment. And so by asking them to stay engaged, they're almost another team member where you're inviting them to your playbacks, you're sharing with them the hills, and you're learning together. And they're giving you their feedback as an active participant in that. And so that, I know I went through a lot of stuff. There's a lot of information around design thinking, but just at its core, what we just kind of walked through was, what are the principles? How do we know if we're doing design thinking? What's kind of our approach into going through kind of design thinking? How do we observe people? How do we go out and do contextual inquiry, in-depth interviews, observations? How do we then reflect on the things that we've learned and understand kind of where we're at? And then how do we make plans to move forward and to make things, but continue that loop? And our keys are really kind of what helps keep this working when we have really large teams and teams of teams that need to be able to communicate across multiple departments, across multiple stakeholders, handling some of the most complex problems that we have, I think, right now. So inside of that, we do have a lot of these tools and resources that we're bundling up and putting together. An example of that is we've published a field guide. And so you can go on to SharePoint and you can just type in the keyword enterprise design thinking, and you can start to look for these field guides that really help give an introduction. And if you can see my screen, right, like this is an example of one of the field guides. You can open it up and it's got kind of helpful tips around how do I actually go step by step to do some of those observations. And once I've done those observations, how do we take kind of our top takeaways and our aha moments and then capture those that we can then later synthesize. And the Start Strong framework is something that was also recently published in a bit of an MVP, which is how do we kind of approach this work? And it's a phased approach to starting your work inside of Spectrum. So definitely take a chance to look at that. And again, like I said earlier, there's a small team of people who've been working on just kind of establishing that framework that we just walked through. And how do we move from consumer insights and patience and provider understanding to then moving into action and taking those kind of opportunities and converting those into things that we can actually create and then bring into the world and then continue to get feedback and relentlessly improve. And so we're building a lot of instructions around that. We're building templates that you can download and Miro templates that you can use. So as again, like you go to our insight page, you can see enterprise design thinking, and our page is constantly changing, but you can see a lot of things up here and different events that we have going on. We have a catalog of resources that you can start to get a little bit more understanding of how to do some of those activities and exercises inside of observe, reflect, and make. And again, these are just a few of them that help, I think, are good foundational ones, but we have hundreds of them kind of behind the scenes that we are able to kind of put together. And then as you're looking at exploring those, you can click on any one of those links in the catalog and start to explore, oh, those hills were really helpful. How can I do one for my own project? How can I maybe establish one for a Pi Day? Or how can I establish one for the next sprint that we're going to kind of work on? And how can I align our teams on those user goals and user outcomes? Now, we have been offering kind of within the ATO, again, the Agile Transformation Office, just the ability for a few of us to come in and do coaching sessions. And we're not here to run a lot of your projects. What we want to do is we want to empower you, but we can help kind of facilitate a little bit or kind of point out some of these activities and tools and make sure you feel comfortable with them as you're moving forward by using design thinking on your work. We've also started working on putting together some courses, and you can go down into Workday. You can also get this on the Design Thinking site. There's a link directly to it. But in Workday, we have a really quick 15-minute overview of just what is design thinking. It kind of just walks you through a lot of the stuff that I just kind of walked through, but in an easy, digestible, self-paced manner. And then we're really working on just how do we start to create courses and move people from practitioners to just understanding some of the basics. How do we continue to upskill people and to be code creators and have a bit more depth into it? And then how do we go all the way to having coaches who have the experience and the expertise of guiding people through those really complicated processes. And those coaches aren't things that are going to just live within inside of one department. These are things that we want as many coaches that are out there in multiple different departments, because we want people who are closest to the work to start making that impact. And of course, we're introducing some leadership courses that are coming out. And leadership courses are really meant to be more focused on not teaching them how to do design thinking, but how do we kind of enable teams and empower teams to do design thinking. And so that enablement is built into a lot of those practices. And of course, we've been starting to introduce a communities of practice. I don't know if some of you have probably heard about that, where it's just a very informal group. But if you're interested in learning about design thinking and collaborating with other like-minded individuals, communities of practice are a great way to come together. And as we do that, we often will have these kinds of sessions where, for example, the last Wednesday of every month is a new member session. So if you're brand new to design thinking, it's great to come to that session, meet other people who are just joining you in that cohort, even just that week or that month. And we can kind of put you guys together, give you a tour of what's going on, and then welcome you to the larger gatherings that we have the first Wednesday of every month. And that's when we bring everybody together and start to share what's going on inside of Spectrum around design thinking. What are some real stories? And who's using it? How is it being applied? Give us some insight into the day-to-day. And then outside of those meetings, we are connecting quite a bit on Teams. And so we do have a dedicated Teams area that allows us to have conversations around what is happening, what are we learning. And so if you're interested in learning about what kind of different events are happening or new methods that are being pushed out or activities that you can use on your work, that's a great way to start staying engaged and also asking questions and meeting other people who are also just trying to figure out how do we really move things from business problems into human problems. So with that, again, I know I've gone through a lot of stuff and there's quite a bit more that's kind of that's going on around design thinking. But what I want to kind of really help us do, if we can, is let's just make whatever things you're working on, let's make sure that we're focusing on the users as our North Star. And let's really focus on how do we create with our users, not just our stakeholders, but how do we interact with real people and pull them in into our work to get feedback, because it's way more empowering and exciting when you're hearing the problems that people have and you have this unfair advantage of actually being able to go and make that change. And then doing that as a team is really important, and bringing more people into those initiatives while you're moving forward. And again, share what you're learning along the way. Don't just silo that into your own department or within your own group. Like, learn something and then share it with others as you're continuing to learn. So again, I know I've talked a lot. I hope this was a bit helpful. Feel free to reach back out. I think we might have a few minutes for questions if people have any, but I appreciate you guys coming to my talk today, and hopefully that gives you a little bit more confidence into jumping into design thinking and a little bit more of some of the approaches that we're starting to introduce around the system. And so with that, I will maybe take it off the presentation mode and maybe open it up to any questions if people have any. I'll see, I'll pull up. And so, yeah, I see Greg DeWeird kind of talks about design thinking integrated into the SAFe process. And I didn't have enough time to talk about how beautiful SAFe and Agile work together. But when you look at Agile, right, what Agile does is it's a great way for us to get things done. Design thinking helps us know and make sure that we're getting the right things done. And that's kind of how you can start to use them together, right? You can do them both separately, but when they're done together, it's like peanut butter and jelly, right? They work really well together. Why would you have them separately when they can be together? And now inside of SAFe does a good job of bringing it beyond just Agile by itself, and it brings it into continuous exploration, and then it goes into continuous iteration. And those things are important, but we notice that if we're only implementing, we're forgetting to continue to explore and understand. So there's a lot more work that we're looking at kind of launching around how to kind of help design thinking just maybe be a sprint or two ahead of some of the implementation teams, to give them the confidence of and the knowledge through playbacks and shared learnings and shared understandings to know who are we impacting and how are we solving those human problems? Because that can be really inspiring and kind of keep us going as teams kind of throughout the day. Any other questions that people might have?
Aaron, this is Jane. Known you for a good chunk of your professional journey, so happy to have you at Spectrum Health. And this session was fantastic. I think one of my wonderings is, as we talk about what feel like disconnects between ODS and maybe this and what's happening with the APMO and SAFE, etc. I wonder if we could apply design thinking to that wicked problem.
I mean, of course, I'm going to say yes, right? What I think that I can actually say is that there's a lot more opportunity to do that more intentionally. I am excited that people are starting to take a step back and start to look at like what are we really trying to do here? Because it can feel overwhelming to have a lot of these different things. And so, but you're right, there is a large opportunity to, again, let's take a step back and let's not focus on the tool. Let's focus on what are we really trying to solve and what are the human needs. And it's really easy for us to kind of to focus on those business goals and those business needs and to kind of remove the humans. I mean, we of course don't do that intentionally, right? But when you're in your own head or when you're starting to like focus on those metrics and those business goals, it's really easy to introduce those processes and systems and not find ourselves looking at how much does that impact our day-to-day stuff. Or maybe we have impacted it and maybe it is a better solution, but it wasn't done right. I know there's often a challenge that we've even heard with any of these processes where it's like, oh, you introduced that to me, but you didn't change anything around how we do things already. And so now you just added something to my list versus made something simpler. And so whereas we might have a lot of good intentions, I think there can be a little bit more empathy built into the process and a little bit more of a feedback loop as we continue to make things a little bit better every single day. So again, I think ODS has a lot of really good things that are kind of coming out. I think SAFE has a lot of good things. I'm a little bit biased more toward that kind of aspect because I think it introduces a bit more of a structure. But you're right. I'd love to be a part of any of that, or even just kind of empower you guys to continue using some of these tools to solve some of those, like you said, wicked problems. Now I'm trying to kind of keep up here. If there's any other questions, does anybody else have any questions? I think we have a few more minutes. Looks like someone says more of a comment. Yeah, there's a lot around usability studies, including usability laboratories. Yeah, I mean, there's so much. When you start to look at UX and design inside of that, there's a lot of crossover, and they're really kind of when you're looking at usability studies, again, those are things that are kind of tied into the same thing as design thinking, right? So when you're designing things, you want to understand what problem are we really solving and put those up there. So there's often like heuristics that we can use to understand, do people feel like they have a sense of place? Do they feel like they understand where things are at? And then there's also, once you've launched something, how do we then do some usability studies and understand, do people actually like what we've created? And just watching people, that's probably one of the, if you've never done a usability study and had somebody use the thing that you've made, it's just the most embarrassing and awkward thing you could go through because you're just in your head, you know everything that's of how it works. And then you see somebody trying to do it and you're like, oh my God, that's not, don't click on that button. Why would you do that? And so I think definitely by doing usability studies, built a lot of empathy, but we need to take that and we need to reflect on the things that we've learned, right? We use a loop, right? We've observed. Now let's reflect on the things that we've learned and how do we then make something better. And that's why the loop is continuous. It's not something that we're trying to introduce this one stop, right? We're trying to say, this needs to continue going and you can jump in at any spot. There's not a wrong way. It's not like start with observe and then go to reflect and then go to make. It's wherever you're at, understand where you're at. Then what do you feel? Do you feel like you need to kind of then make something, observe more, or reflect on the things that you've made? Looks like we might have another minute. I want to give you guys some time and a break between your next session. So if there is one more question. Awesome. Well, I may be just going to kind of pause it there. I really appreciate you guys walking through this with me. Again, feel free to reach out to me on Teams or via email. I will push this presentation up along with everything else. But I just thank you so much for your time and for coming out today. Have a good one.